Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar on building effective cyber intelligence programs. Today's webinar is hosted by Anomali, a signatory of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord and a threat intelligence program that enables businesses to integrate security products as well as leverage data to defend against cyber threats. Last year, the Tech Accord announced a new partnership with the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise to strengthen cyber capacity building through the exchange of best practices. To further our commitment under that umbrella, we launched a series of webinars to help increase the understanding of key cybersecurity topics, such as the one you'll hear today. Today's webinar is presented by AJ Nash, Director of Cyber Intelligence Strategy, where he focuses on building cyber intelligence programs to help protect personnel, facilities, data, and information systems. For the purpose of today's webinar, we welcome you to share questions using the chat box located on the right side of your screen, as there will be time at the end of the presentation to address any questions. And now I'd like to welcome AJ.
Thank you very much. As you mentioned, my name is AJ Nash. I'm the Director of Cyber Intelligence Strategy for Anomali. Today we're going to talk a little bit about building effective cyber intelligence programs. A little background on myself before we jump in, just so everybody knows who they're listening to. I've got about 18 years experience in the U.S. government originally. Half that time spent active duty U.S. Air Force, the other half as a defense contractor. Worked in counterintelligence, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, countering trafficking in persons, chased war criminals for a couple of years. Traditional intelligence analyst. And then the last handful of years in the government space, I focused on countering threats in cyberspace. Most of that time spent either at NSA or U.S. Cyber Command. Transferred into the private sector about 5 years ago now. I've helped a large bank start their program in cyber intelligence and spent the last few years at a large tech company on the commercial side for the first couple of years, working with dozens of companies around the world. And then the last year building another program inside the company before coming over to Anomali. So my career has been focused on traditional intelligence practices and standards and either building programs or helping others build programs. So that's really my primary focus. And today we're going to do a relatively high overview of how to build programs and some of the foundational information that we need to go into doing that. So let's jump into this. All right. So in the industry, generally speaking, we run into a lot of the same questions if we're inside an organization trying to build a program or if we're consulting with somebody looking to do so. Who are the adversaries and what are their motives? And how are we going to prepare for them? Are we under attack? And if so, have they already been successful? And how do we respond to that? And sadly, in most cases, if we're being honest with ourselves, the answer to most of these questions is I don't know. And the challenge here is because we don't have intelligence programs in most cases. The industry is getting better over time. Private sector has really caught on to the idea of intelligence. In the last handful of years, it's gone from just a notion to a lot of programs being built. But now we're getting to the point of trying to understand what we're trying to build and what we're trying to accomplish. And ultimately, it's to answer these questions. So let's set the stage a little bit. What are we solving for? That's one of the first things you want to think about when you're going to build an intelligence program. And three areas that come up repeatedly are fear, data overload, and proactivity. So fear is a rather impressive motivator. It's great for building programs and building budgets. Nobody wants to be the next big target, right? Anthem, Target, Home Depot, Equifax, Capital One recently. You can just go on with the list. And nobody wants to be on that list. Certainly our leadership doesn't want to be there. It's bad for business. It's bad for careers. So that has been a rather significant motivator to move the industries towards building intelligence programs. One of the other challenges we're dealing with is data overload. So we are certainly not short on inputs, whether it's SIM, something like Logarithm or Splunk or ArcSight, flooding us with data, or now everything we're seeing, say, in open source, whether it's news media or social media, or if we have feeds coming in from any sort of intel providers, we're certainly not short on input. Now one of our biggest challenges in cybersecurity is trying to figure out how to make sense of all of that. And then the last piece is proactivity. We don't want to be in a reactive state, and that's where most organizations still are today. And we're trying to get past that. That's organizations that live on their SIM, right? And they're looking through their logs and looking through their internal telemetry. The challenge there is whatever you're finding is already reactive. It's already inside your environment. So we want to move from reactive to proactive. A lot of times when I talk about threats, I talk about on a timeline from left to right, if you can imagine that. The goal is to be left of boom. Now, this is a kinetic term we use talking about counterterrorism, or war fighting. And boom was, a bomb or a terrorist attack. And if you're right of the boom on that timeline, it's a pretty bad day. It's blood and guts and battle damage assessment. It's unpleasant. So the goal is to stay left of boom. It's not too different in cyber. There's a lot less score, so we hope. But if we're on the right side of that boom, then we're dealing with 24-hour operations and bridge calls and executive pressures, and it's a really unpleasant experience. So we want to stay left of boom. But to do that, that's about proactivity, and that's really where intelligence fits in, is being able to look beyond our environment, beyond the horizon, and see what's coming before it gets to the wire for us. So another key focus here is, who are we serving? There's different levels within any organization. The tactical technical is the most obvious and still the most served right now among organizations that are building intel programs. That's really IOC focus. That's taking all of your IPs and URLs, your signatures, and driving them into your cybersecurity solutions. That's where a big chunk of the world is right now, the majority, I would say, the private sector. But we need to be moving beyond that into operational and strategic levels. And what I mean by that is operational is something that helps focus our management, to understand what personnel we need, how we need to focus our teams and organizations and structure them. And then the strategic level, which is more of the larger picture, right? The 3, 6, 9, 12-month outlook. Intelligence is going to drive leadership, executive leadership decisions on where the corporation needs to go and where the market's headed. So we need to be able to drive to those answers. Right now, most organizations haven't reached that level of maturity yet, but we're working with a lot of other really smart folks around this industry to raise that level. So we can get to the point where when we talk about cyber intelligence, it's not just talking about the SOC, which is really, really important, but we're also starting to talk about physical security and procurement and M&A and executive leadership and being able to brief the board and moving that intelligence message up within an organization. All right, so before I go too much further, I like to talk about the difference between data, information, and intelligence. This is really foundational information that we need to understand because there's a lot of conflating of these terms. And you'll notice here, this graphic is from Joint Publication 2-0, that's U.S. military doctrine. I'm not somebody who believes in trying to invent concepts for intelligence or reinvent them or turn this into some marketing opportunity, as a lot of folks want to do. There are tried and true, well-established standards within the U.S. and Western governments that have been doing intelligence a long time. My focus is generally trying to bring the best of breed into the private sector. So JP 2-0 is a really large book and a long read, worth reading if you have the time. But in this case, we're going to talk about the difference between data, information, and intelligence. And a simple way to look at this chart, I'll put it in an easier context, is if I gave you a large list of IPs and URLs, that's not intelligence. There are vendors who will sell you that information now and tell you this is an intelligence feed, and it's not. That's data. It's raw. It's important. You absolutely need it, but it is not intelligence. It's the wrong term to use. If I give you that same list of IPs or URLs and I add some sort of threat score to it, some context, that's still not intelligence. That's information. So it's, again, very, very important. These are foundational building blocks for what we're trying to accomplish. But again, that's not intelligence. When we talk about intelligence, we'll take that same list of IPs or URLs. We'll take that same context, that threat score, for instance, but we also apply more understanding, more to that information. So we'll add what actors have been associated with that IP or URL, what their tactics, techniques, and procedures have been, when that infrastructure was safe, when it wasn't safe, a timeline to background that. Now you're getting into a full picture of what started as data and moved to information and gives you that full picture, which is intelligence. Ultimately, you want to have some sort of an assessment that goes with this as well to put it in context for leadership or any reader for that matter, to be able to say, this is what we know about this architecture. Here's the actors associated with it. Here's the TTPs. Here are the expected next results. If we have something like that, some sort of an assessment, now you're getting a clear picture of what intelligence is. And this is generally going to be something that's either done by really high-level vendors, of which there are several, or as we drive further, organizations are going to be building more of their own intelligence as they're able to bring in the right talent and build these finished pictures that are customized to their needs. All right, so how do we define intelligence? Well, that's a tricky question. There is no single definition for intelligence. Even in the intelligence community, there's a handful within the US community. Generally, every agency has their own spin on it. They're all really similar. And the private sector doesn't have an agreed upon definition at all. So the definition I've put together here is really cobbling together a couple from the intelligence community and taking out some government specific language. You don't really need to read the whole thing or memorize it. What it really comes down to is intelligence is the product of a process. And the goal of intelligence is to provide leadership with what they need to make informed decisions. So that's what we're trying to do. Product of a process designed to give leadership what they need to make informed decisions. That's what we're trying to accomplish with intelligence. All right, so I'm going to come back to that process later, put a pin in that. So we'll talk about some of the categories of cyber threat intelligence. Ultimately, there's essentially three basic categories. Now, I'm sure there's opportunities to create others here. These are the three I've focused on. Cybercrime, cyber espionage, and hacktivism. So how we split these out is generally cybercrime is money for money's sake. This isn't remarkably different from the guy who walks into a bank with a gun. They're just doing it with other means. So you're talking about ATM jackpotting, business email compromise, things like that. Things that are really designed just for money. When you talk about cyber espionage, generally that's data. So let me get back to that in a second. And then hacktivism. I think we're familiar with hacktivism. I would say somebody like Anonymous, right? That's pretty much well known. 5 years ago, I would have thought hacktivism was going to be the scourge of the universe. Hasn't turned out that way. Hacktivism has become more of a nuisance than anything. Some of the examples you'll see that go with these categories. So for hacktivism, for instance, DDoS attacks and website defacements and brand assassination, which can be done through social media. Now, these are important and you certainly have to watch for them, but these would be sort of low-hanging fruit compared to some of the things we deal with. All right, so let me return to espionage. I mentioned data. And this is always something I get challenged on. PII data or IP theft, how is that not cyber crime is a common question. And I'm not suggesting it's not. The reason I've got this categorized where I do is when the data is stolen, until you understand who's taken it or have the ability to make some sort of an assessment, I treat it as espionage, as data being stolen. And it can be nation state. It also can be corporate espionage, company versus company happens. If that data is marketed, if we find that IP or PII showing up in a deep or dark web market, then the assessment would change. And more likely than not, you're talking about a cybercrime organization. Now, that also can be used to mask nation state. If nation state took what they wanted and wanted to sell the rest to cover it, there's always that possibility. There's a lot more detail that goes into that assessment. But the best way to understand why this fits under nation state, in my opinion at least, is an example I'll give you. So if I was a nation state and I wanted to put together some pretty strong human intelligence targeting, I might target a large healthcare organization of a nation, especially if it's tied to any sort of military organizations within that country. I might also choose to target, the organization that handles all of the clearances, security clearances for that country. And then perhaps an organization that handles most, if not all, of the credit reporting for that country. If I was able to take all three of those data sets together, I could build a pretty nice targeting platform where I would understand everybody in the country who has a security clearance, access to very sensitive information, who also may or may not have financial difficulties for themselves or their family, and may or may not have health difficulties for themselves or their family. That's a really good opportunity to understand who I should be targeting as a potential asset I could turn in my favor. Now, that's not remarkably hypothetical. All three of those breaches have happened, and none of that data from those breaches ever made it into the deep or dark web. So that's an example, and it's real life. And I'm going to turn back to the left one more time here, just on cybercrime. I mentioned ransomware in there. So ransomware is traditionally a criminal activity. We have seen recently a change. I'm sure most people are familiar with WannaCry, which has been attributed to a nation state with different varying degrees of confidence span who's done the attribution. But the reason I still list this under cybercrime is the vast majority of ransomware is still criminal activity. We may have an outlier. We're not 100% sure that's a nation state. It seems likely. But even so, the vast majority of ransomware is criminal behavior, and it's a growing problem for us. All right, so we've talked a little bit about categories for intelligence. Let's talk about how we operationalize our intelligence. Big slide, a lot of data here. Even though this is designed left to right, I actually start on the right-hand side. Repeating what I'd said a little bit before about understanding who we're serving, it's really important if you're going to build a program to have a stakeholder analysis. Understand who your customers are, because these are going to require different outputs. The executive audience has normally, not always, but normally has less interest in the very technical details that a tactical audience would need. The IPs and URLs and signatures and hashes don't often matter to somebody in the C-suite. So we need to understand who our audience is. We need to do a stakeholder assessment. And that list is going to be ideally longer than you imagine right now. Again, we need to get beyond the SOC. This isn't just about red team, blue team. We need to start looking at a larger picture of where intelligence organizations can support large enterprises. So once we've established our understanding of who we think our stakeholders will be, then it's really important, moving back to the left, to do priority intelligence requirements or intelligence requirements. There's different terminology depending on how you have them set up. But we need to document what we're trying to accomplish. This is where most organizations I see fail. They've reached the point where they want to build an intel program. They may have even understood to a point who their audience will be. They've secured some budget, but they haven't taken the time to sit down and determine what they're trying to accomplish, which is a little surprising. This isn't all that different from building a computer system or a piece of software. Engineers and technical audiences are very familiar with how to build requirements documents for those large Excel spreadsheets. This is a little bit simpler in my opinion, but you need to build some intelligence requirements to understand what we're accomplishing. Now there's documentation on how to build intelligence requirements. The government has a lot of different ways of doing it that I think some are better than others. But ultimately an intelligence requirement needs to be relatively simple, frankly. A requirement should be one question and it should be answerable in a measurable way. So these large ethereal, tell me, everything that's a threat in the environment is not an intelligence requirement. Breaking them down to very small, answerable questions, such as what are all the known or suspected threats against, Siemens ICS control systems. Even that might be a little large. You may want to break it down subsets into specific ICS control systems, specific versions, for instance. But that is an intelligence requirement. That gives an intelligence team an opportunity to chase answers to a specific question. So anyway, when we're building requirements, we need to understand our own assets and what's most valuable and who has access and what technologies we depend on. So I mentioned assets here. Another really large challenge in the industry we need to focus on. Intelligence organizations are very dependent, obviously, on what they're bringing in, whether it's external intelligence or internal knowledge. And industry-wide, globally, I've seen a real challenge when it comes to CMDBs and when it comes to crown jewels assessments. And these are vital for intelligence organizations. When leadership comes and says, all right, I've seen there's a threat in the world, tell me what it means to me, the challenge an intel organization will have is, I may not be able to answer that question. If I don't know our environment backwards and forwards, then I can't give you the context you need. So if there's a zero-day exploit against software system A, and the question is, well, how does that affect us? My response is going to be, well, how many instances of software system A do we have, and where are they located, and what data is co-located with them, and what are the controls in those areas? And oftentimes we just don't have those answers. So when building an intelligence program, it's important to understand what our limitations will be and to make sure leadership is aware of other programs that also need to be built in concert or improved, because there are dependencies there. And that isn't to say an Intel program can't function without an up-to-date CMDB or without crown jewels assessment. We absolutely can and do. Just understanding that we are going to have reduced effectiveness when it comes to context until we have those other pieces of the puzzle filled in. All right, so that moves us on to goals. We need to understand what the organization is trying to accomplish, whether we're just working on detecting or defending our attribution and prosecution. And the last one I'm going to talk about, attribution. So a lot of organizations are very focused on attribution. I want to know who. And then when you ask them why they want to know that, they have a very hard time articulating an answer. So in my opinion, there's two reasons to care about attribution. And if we have folks who want to chime in afterwards who have other ideas, that's awesome. But the two reasons I've often put forward are either A, you can do something about it. You're a government, you can strike back, you have the ability to either take a cyber solution to it or a kinetic solution or a legal solution. You have the ability to strike back. Or the second one goes back to proactivity. We want to understand who has done something, because if we understand that that this activity is tied to a specific adversary and we have high confidence, and we know about that adversary's other activities in the past, we may be able to look through our systems and find out where they are, where we think they're going, how far they've gotten along their known path. Actors often tend to use the same tactics, techniques, procedures in the same order of operations. So those are the two reasons. Either we can strike back, or we're trying to move towards proactivity to understand what might be coming next. Everything else is just gee whiz. And that's unfortunate. There's a lot of leadership who wants to know the who because it's a flashy story, but it may not really make us better. All right, then capabilities and limitations. We need to be honest with ourselves about our personnel, our tools, our accesses, and the budget. A lot of organizations have talked to me and said, well, we're dedicated to this. We want to build a world-class intelligence organization. And then they follow that up in the very next sentence by saying they have $250,000 to spend. And those two just aren't going to go together. In all honesty, if you have $250,000 to spend, that's a good place to start. I'm not suggesting people shouldn't build a program with that, but you have a long road to get to world class. Personnel alone are going to be challenging, not even including the technologies and the accesses that you're going to need. But so we have to be honest about what we have there, and then access and authorities. I've already mentioned the challenge of CMDBs and crown jewels assessments, for instance, but also a lot of organizations are very stovepiped. Financials specifically come to mind, where you can't, the Intel team doesn't have access to fraud data, for instance. The most access is the best for Intel, and that's challenging. That's why you need to hire really strong, qualified intelligence professionals that are well vetted, because they are going to have access to a lot of information. But ideally, they have access to just about everything in the company, right up there with, say, an insider threat program, who they also should be working with. And then the last thing on here is prioritizing our sources. Just understanding all sources aren't equal. I've talked to organizations who said, well, we don't need an Intel program. We monitor Twitter. And that's just not how it works. Social media is a good indicator of things. It's a great place to start. It can be a good tipper for things, but it's far less valuable than even sharing groups like ISACs or IOC feeds that are coming in from vetted sources, or certainly finished intelligence. These are not all the same thing. All right. So let's talk about the simple math of intelligence. If you remember my resume, I didn't mention anything about math, so I'm not much on the numbers side of things, which is why this equation doesn't have any. But the simple math of intelligence to me is talent times access times time. These are the essential elements for building an intelligence team, building an intelligence program, or building specific products. So I'm going to go ahead and run through each of these and give us a little understanding of what I'm talking about. All right, first we'll talk about the talent. So when we talk about building a program, obviously we're going to need personnel to make this happen. And there's a few ways to work through this, in my opinion. We can build the entire team internal to the company. It's going to be more expensive. Intelligence professionals are not easy to come by, and they're not cheap. The industry is getting better. The government space tends to be where most professionalized intelligence personnel are grown, which is great. So the military and the U.S. government trains them for you and builds them up, and then they leave and look for greener pastures in the private sector. And the government is bleeding bodies for a number of reasons that we're definitely not going to talk about here. But the government is definitely losing some really strong talent, so that's good. The other place now in private industry, we're starting to see the education world, the academia is starting to build intelligence professionals. So there's a handful of programs out there now that are built directly off of intelligence standards, government standards. Mercyhurst comes to mind, James Madison University, Robert Morris. There's a handful out there, Georgetown, for instance. And some of those programs are even combining the traditional intelligence professionals with a cybersecurity program. James Madison University, again, comes to mind for that. So we're building more talent, but there's still a huge gap. People talk about the cybersecurity talent gap. The gap percentage-wise for intelligence is probably even larger. But one thing we don't want to do here is we don't want to make a mistake in that key hire. So I'll talk about that in a minute on who I think the key hires should be. But just note, we don't want to make a mistake there. So internal, going to be hard to do. It's going to have increased costs, and there's challenges in hiring. The good news is you do control those people. So you have increased control and visibility. You can make sure the personnel you have are focused on your needs, and you can drive results there and make changes if it turns out you have the wrong personnel. Another option here is outsourcing. That's where you just push it all to different vendors and say, you guys are going to be my solution. It definitely reduces your cost. Large vendors, and there's several out there that do really strong intelligence, have the assets, and they're going to spread those assets across a wide variety of customers. So it will reduce cost overall, takes away your overhead, takes away fringe, for instance. It's a contract. If it turns out it's not where you want to go, you can cut the contract. You don't have to deal with unemployment and all these other things go with hiring personnel. But you also lose control and visibility. You're not going to be able to dictate all the successes you want on vendors. You can push them in a lot of directions, and some vendors are really, really responsible and are going to work to get your needs. But it's never going to be the same as if you own the personnel. That's just the nature of how it works. They're spread across, like I said, other customers. So you lose a little bit of control and visibility. And as a result, the intelligence may not always meet your needs. It's one of the big challenges I see with vendors and customers working together is communication, is making sure we get the intelligence requirements documented and communicated. We also run into issues with companies who farm things out to vendors and then find out there's things they can't share with those vendors. Their legal organization gets involved. And even with an NDA, there's things they don't want to share, which leaves some of your vendors in the dark. And again, as I mentioned, you want the widest access possible when doing intelligence. So that can be a complication. The approach I tend to recommend is the hybrid approach. And that's where you have a strong cadre of controlled assets. So you can have a limited number inside the company. You don't have to have a massive team necessarily, but you have a strong cadre of controlled assets. It helps you with your hiring process in that you don't have to find 30 amazing Intel analysts. You can find a handful and get the same results by farming out the rest of the work to vendors. Make sure you have somebody who's either got experience or willing to take on the challenge of vendor management. You still have to do your intelligence requirements process and then make sure that's communicated. But if you build these strong relationships, there's a lot of value in doing that. It will reduce your cost. It does ease up your hiring issues. So you can still meet your needs while doing it with a bit lower overhead. So that's the approach I tend to recommend. It's the approach I've used when I build programs, and it's the approach I recommend to others. So I mentioned the key hire. So this is a big one for me, and this is controversial for some. In my opinion, the intelligence program leader needs to be an intelligence professional. So there are always exceptions to this rule. So I understand there's probably somebody right now listening to this who thinks that exception, they may be. But the big challenge I've seen globally is industry has reached the point where they understand we want to build an intelligence program. Leadership's come down with that. Boards have pushed for this, and C-suites have pushed for this, and now it's okay, we're going to build an intelligence program. So we've got that momentum. Well, how do we do that? And often the first discussion is who's going to run the program, and leadership looks around and says, Bob's due for a promotion. Bob's been one hell of a manager for us. He's a great IR guy. He's really, really smart. Bob, you're the new director of cyber intelligence. Build me a CTI team. And that's where they go wrong. So, and it's not Bob's fault. Bob's great at his job. Bob's a good manager. He's a good leader. He's a good IR guy. Bob's not an Intel guy. So Bob tries to figure out how to build an Intel program. Oftentimes he turns around and hires 3 more Bobs. And within a year, you figure out what you really have is another IR program. You've got another team that's focused really on the technical, and they can give you all the IOCs, and they can build you great databases, but they can't put any context on things. They can't give you finished intelligence projects. They can't tell you what might be coming down the road. They don't understand estimative language. There's just a whole gap in the skill set. And unfortunately, a year or so later, people figure that out, and Bob and his whole team get fired. So Bob went from being this great performer who had a great career to being unemployed. And this isn't hypothetical. I've seen this in person on more than one occasion. It's very important to make sure we get the right person leading the program. Now, there are exceptions. I know that. I've seen really strong technical leaders who are hired to run programs. The exception is if that person understands they're not an intelligence professional, they hire intelligence professionals, and they defer to them on all the intelligence issues, and they just allow themselves to run the larger program and be sort of a program manager and a good leader, but don't really get into the weeds of how to do finished intelligence products, for instance. And there just aren't enough people like that from what I've seen. So I think it's very important that the intelligence professional start to build the program. And once you have that person, it's just so much easier. That person will, first of all, will be able to recruit more talent. It may be challenging to find who the right people are in the intelligence community. And unfortunately, it's hard to vet resumes in a lot of cases. Having an intelligence professional fixes a lot of that. Most of us, it's a small industry, it's a small community. Many people know each other or know somebody who knows somebody. It can help with recruiting to make sure you have less hiring mistakes. And then it's somebody that can get things going in the right direction in terms of analytic standards and tradecraft and how to build programs. Now, again, I mentioned academia. If you find somebody who's come out of a really strong academic program and has the foundation and also has worked in industry for a bit, they could theoretically fill this role as well. So it isn't a binary must be, intelligence community, top secret cleared person or not. There are shades of gray here. But what I'm trying to say is don't just take a manager who's done a great job in a completely different function and assume they can be your intelligence lead. I've seen most organizations fail while doing that. Not all skill sets translate. Just my mechanic is an incredible mechanic, but I really don't want her to be my brain surgeon. So not all skill sets are the same. All right. So let's talk about the intelligence cycle now. I talked about a process earlier. Intelligence is a process of product of a process. This is the process. So this is the intelligence cycle or the intelligence life cycle. It's straight out of the intelligence community. Again, my graphic may be a little bit different. I've seen it with 5 boxes or 6, but this is what it comes down to. And I mentioned intelligence requirements. So it all starts again with intelligence requirements. We need to have those to drive everything else. Otherwise, we don't know what's important and not important, and we're living in the dark. Once we understand our requirements, that drives our collection. That can help us also when it comes to vendor selection. If we understand what we're trying to accomplish, we're in a much better position now to score out vendors as we're trying to figure out who we want to bring in for a lot of our intelligence needs. But we need to know what we're looking for. And the vendors will love you for having intelligence requirements. Vendors want to succeed. They want to help you. They want to understand what your needs are too. And a lot of times vendors fail in their relationship with customers because of this communication problem. Customers can't quite say what they're looking for. Vendors don't quite understand, and they miss each other. And it isn't that the vendor's failing or that the customer's failing, it's that the communication hasn't been put in place. So once we have the collection process figured out, then it's processing, analysis, production, how the sausage is made. I'll talk about a little bit about that in a minute. And then dissemination, and that arrow is a feedback loop. It's incredibly important. Obviously, we have to have a way to disseminate products. We have to have a way to send papers to people. Technical data has to get to the proper machines and the proper personnel. But that feedback loop is a huge challenge. Most organizations fail here, including the government, quite frankly. Intelligence is a relationship business. The intelligence organization needs to build relationships with all their stakeholders, have regular engagements, and be able to have frank discussions and say, hey, we sent these things to you. Did you read them? It's a good first question. A lot of times the answer is no, sadly. If you did you understand them? Did you use them? How can we make them better? You need to develop a strong relationship with your stakeholders and build a feedback loop. Otherwise, over time, I've seen organizations where the intelligence ends up being ignored. And it's a massive waste of time and resources. So that's the intelligence cycle in a loop. So I mentioned how the sausage is made, the production process. You need to have analytic standards. So the analytic standards I've used mirror the intelligence community directives. So ICDs are unclassified, readily available. You can Google that term. There's about 800 of them. So I wouldn't run around reading all of them. But ICD 203, 206, and 208, if you want to take a note on a couple quick things you can read, it's about 15 pages maybe in total, are definitely worth reading. And they'll give you a good understanding of analytic rigor, specifically words, like high, medium, and low confidence, for instance. Words matter. Words are incredibly important in intelligence. And the key pieces here are A, to apply proper standards, but B, to be able to teach your stakeholders what they are. Because if I sent an intelligence product to leadership in most companies, and I had a low confidence assessment based on limited intelligence that China was going to attack us, for instance, or I had a high confidence assessment based on a large body of reporting that China was going to attack us, most organizations only read China's going to attack us, and they didn't understand any of the precursor. So it's very important when building programs that we do them properly. We have the right verbiage, the right caveats, but we also have to educate our readership. So I'm also a big believer in having some sort of a reader's guide, again, as you're building that relationship with your stakeholders, to be able to teach them and coach them a bit on how to read intelligence products so they get the right context. Otherwise, we're going to have people reacting improperly to intelligence as it's coming forward. One of the benefits of intelligence, if done properly, isn't just about awareness. It's also sometimes about context that can reduce stress. The news and the media make everything sound pretty bad these days. There's a lot of vendors that are happy to do that too, quite frankly. But being in a position where when we read this news story and it sounds scary, we have an intelligence team that can come back and say, this isn't actually new. This has been around for 6 months. This is just a recycled story with a slight twist on it. We already know about it, and this is what it looks like, and we have high confidence that this isn't a problem for us, can greatly reduce stress for leadership and make for better days for everybody. All right, so I've talked about talent. Let's talk about access. So this is a quick graphic that just shows what access for an intelligence program might look like. As you can see, I've thrown some of our products in this one. But from left to right on the top, you've got all this open source coming in, all your news, all your social media. You got premium vendors. There's a list here. There's a long list beyond that, of course. Anomaly Labs happens to be our Intel team. The ISACs, if you remember, an ISAC, government sharing. You've got all of this coming in. You got to figure out a way to make sense of all of that. And that's where a threat intelligence platform, I think, is vital. Obviously, Anomaly Threat Stream is the one I've provided here. It happens to be where I work. But it's really important to have an intelligence platform to make sense of everything coming in. A lot of organizations are bringing all this in; they're overwhelmed with it. If you get a solid intelligence platform, with some machine learning in it that can connect dots for you and make some research much easier to get through, that's really important. Plus, it serves as your central repository for all of your intelligence. And then being able to connect that with, say, a SIM, like Logarithm or Splunk. I've got Anomaly Enterprise listed here, which plugs into a lot of SIMs and actually accelerates and amplifies what we're getting out of those. And then a SOAR solution. In this case, I use CyberResponse. There's others, of course. If you're Splunk shop, you might have Phantom, for instance. But being able to bring all that together, so you can have intelligence tied directly to your environment, given the right parameters and the right tuning, you could use a SOAR solution to actually be able to resolve your tier 1 problems with few, if any, human interactions. But then on the other side, with the intelligence team, the outputs of intelligence, tactical, technical, I already mentioned, operational, strategic, physical security, I've got called out separately here, as I find it incredibly important. The intelligence team can have outputs that are customized to the stakeholder needs and go beyond, again, just the SOC. So your tactical, technical can be your SOC personnel, your offensive cyber operations, your defensive cyber operations. But physical security, incredibly important. Physical and cyber are often connected to one another and can tip each other off. It's very important to work with your physical security team. I could have put insider threat on here, another place where I think intelligence is incredibly important. And then your operational and strategic, and just some examples of how to communicate these levels. Generally, when you talk tactical, technical, and even physical, I believe email, Slack, things like that are sufficient for those organizations. When you get into operational and strategic, it's often written papers, web pages, and even mobile apps if you're capable of creating that. All right, and then time. So we're talking about talent access. Now let's talk about time. We can't do much about time, but we need to understand it at least. And one of our challenges here is it's a shortening time window for threat actors. On average, it takes about almost 200 days to identify a compromise and another nearly 70 before we can contain that breach. Unfortunately, threat actors' planning cycles are getting much shorter. They go from dev to sale to in use on new tools within a matter of days. So we're losing the time battle, to be quite frank. This is why intelligence is important, so we can get proactive and get ahead of some of these things. And that includes things like monitoring deep and dark web, forums where actors are talking about building new tools, or might be talking about who they plan on targeting. But when we talk about time, it's important that intelligence be timely and accurate. A lot of organizations want to focus on just the timely part. And timeliness is not the only metric for success in intelligence, and it's really not the best metric. It's important to make sure that proper analytic tradecraft has been applied, the proper confidence levels are there, and that we're getting the right information, the right intelligence to the right people at the right time, which isn't always immediately. And a story I've often told with this is years ago, I used to coach high school football, and I'm a big fan of fast players. Most coaches are, because you really can't coach speed. But I'm not a big fan of fast players who are stupid, because the dumb player who's fast just gets out of position a whole lot quicker and doesn't do me a lot of good. So it's important to make sure you have that right combination of fast and smart. And that's what we talk about with intelligence, is making sure that what we're getting is proper. So as you bring in vendors, or as your team does intelligence, a lot of organizations fail to go back and grade them out and see were they successful. So there's plenty of vendors happy to take advantage of that and be first. They'll be very quick when a news story comes out to rush out with something that gives them a high confidence assessment that this is what we know it to be true, because they know most organizations won't go back and check and see if they were actually right. That's really dangerous. When you're going to act on intelligence, you want to have confidence the intelligence is correct, and fast is only one of the metrics. So I'm more concerned with accurate, and that combination of timely and accurate is where you want to end up. All right, so that finishes us off for the slide deck. Basically right on time. I was asked to do this in about 40 minutes. It looks like I'm at 39. So again, my name is AJ Nash, and I'm the Director of Cyber Intelligence Strategy. I'm going to open up the forum here for any questions, comments, concerns, criticisms. I know I've got a friend on the line who said he was going to throw tomatoes at me, so I'm open for that too. Let's just chat.
Thanks, AJ. I've got a couple questions for you. I'll just shoot them your way. For someone who's new to threat intelligence, where should they start? Should that be open source feeds or somewhere else?
That's a good question. So if you're new to intelligence, are we? I'm going to try and do this without. I know you can't clarify because you just got the question. So there's a couple ways to look at this. If you're new to intelligence as a practitioner and you're just trying to learn how to do intelligence, I'm a big believer, obviously, in reading some of the documentation I mentioned and getting some education on it. If you're talking about new to building a program and what do you start with, yeah, open source is certainly a good place to start. One of the concerns I have is organizations that start bringing in a lot of different outside sources, but again, don't know what to do with it because they get overwhelmed. So I'm actually a pretty big believer in a threat intelligence platform. I know that'll sound self-serving since that's a company I work for, and I'm cognizant of that. But to be clear, when I've built programs, that's where I've started as well. And I was a customer of Anomali before I became an employee. So ideally, you've got enough on the front end that you can get a threat intelligence platform that already comes with a lot of feeds. Ours happens to come with 131 feeds, I believe, right now. So when you get a platform, you already get open source intelligence with that platform, which is a great place to start. And you start having a place to put more things in as you're going forward. So I tend to recommend that. If you're going to just start with feed first, I would probably look for more technical work first, because that's where you're going to get the biggest successes early on, is bringing in solid technical data, telemetry that you can plug into a lot of your security controls, or that you can work with your SOC on. Generally, as we're building programs, we start with the technical, and then work our way up. You can get some measurable successes there too.
Great. And then let's see. So with a lot of different sources of threat intelligence, how do you filter the noise and minimize false positives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that actually is going to lead back to technologies in a lot of cases. So false positives are a huge problem, as everybody knows, and we get overwhelmed with a lot of that noise. It is, I'm going to sound like a broken record here. It's unfortunate, two questions kind of run in the same direction, but that's the power of a threat intelligence platform, is being able to dedupe, being able to connect dots, and also eliminate things that are false positives, right? So our platform, for instance, has a filter in it, and you actually can look in the back at your feeds to see what's been pulled out as false positives and what the rates are. And based on those rates, you can determine if those are specific feeds you want to continue to have if the false positive rate's very high. It's incredibly hard to sift out false positives manually. It's doable, but it's incredibly hard. It's a lot of time and energy. So generally, that's where a lot of our technologies are going to come into play. It's where we can connect a lot of those dots through machine learning, and also eliminate things that aren't going to be applicable.
Awesome. Okay, so this one is a bit of a loaded question. And first, I just want to say thanks again for sharing with us some information about how to build cyber intelligence programs. Now, this question comes, and there's three parts to it. So, what is a realistic timeline for building a robust threat intelligence program? And how much budget do we need to set aside to do this? Then last part is, once we are up and running, how do you recommend we evaluate the ROI of that threat intelligence program?
That's a good question. That's a good series of questions. So how much budget? A lot. No, I'm just kidding. It's somewhat true, but all right. So the timeline can vary. It certainly depends on the size of the program and what the intended outputs are. I can tell you in past experience, to go from nothing to what I would consider to be initial operating capacity on a program, if you have leadership buy-in, strong support, and some budget flexibility, I would say you're probably looking at somewhere around 9 months. 6 months to a year would be a safer estimate, right? So I'd say somewhere around 9. If you want to get to what I would call a fully operational program, that 9 month part probably gets you around industry standard. If you want to get closer to the high end of the industry, you're probably looking at another 9 months. But those are very dependent on a strong leadership support, and certainly some the strong budget necessary to do it. So that brings to the second question, which is how much budget. Budget's really challenging. So a really mature program like the one I showed that graphic for, you're going to be looking at a threat intel platform, a handful of premium feeds, and even if we do the handful of controlled assets, with the rest being farmed out in terms of labor, you're probably talking 1 to 2 million plus personnel. We'll call personnel. Yeah, probably $2 to $3 million. Most of that's upfront, so that isn't necessarily year over year, because you can pay a lot of those contracts upfront. which I happen to recommend for what it's worth. Given the opportunity, if you get strong leadership support and budget support, I'm a big believer in spending the budget when you have it, because leadership moves and changes, and so do politics within corporations. So I'm a big believer in 3-year contracts paid up front. You get discounts on it, and you lock in the security of your program, so that if there's changing tides within the company, you're not going to be fighting for budget annually. But yeah, you're probably talking, like I said, about 2 or 3 mil in a pretty large program. Now, that isn't to say if you don't have that, don't build a program. That's ridiculous, of course. You can start as little as a couple $100,000 and one body, and just start building forward from there. Just understand the timeline I mentioned earlier extends quite a bit, depending on where you're going to go with that. And then the third piece was ROI. And ROI is a really tough question to answer in intelligence. It's not like building it's not like firewalls where you get all these alerts and you can just kick out number after number. Security technologies are great for building out metrics that can be used to justify ROI, even if they're somewhat empty metrics sometimes. The ROI for intelligence is a little more challenging. What I will say, what I have said to folks is, we need to stop thinking about intelligence the same way we think about other cybersecurity offerings. To me, cyber intelligence is more like insurance, health insurance, for instance, or physical security for a bank. I haven't been sick in years, significantly at least, but I'm not canceling my health insurance because I understand it's an inevitability. Something bad will happen in my life, and I need the insurance when it does. Or as a bank, if I hadn't been robbed for a couple of years, I'm spending millions of dollars on all these different resources and personnel and technologies for a large banking organization. If I haven't been robbed in a couple of years, my accounting might think I'm overspending, but I'm probably not going to actually drop my security program because I understand it's an inevitability I'm going to be robbed. And that's a lot of how I look at cyber intelligence. Is the ROI is measured in a lot of cases in what we stop and what we're not compromised by. So every time I see a large breach, we're able to get ahead of that and say, well, we've learned from that experience, we've pulled that information, we've made some changes on our end, and as a result, nothing happened. That's the return on investment, and that's a challenge because that's like a negative ROI to try to measure out of explaining what didn't happen. But that's one of the areas there. Now there's some easier metrics you can get in terms of again the tactical, being able to take a lot of that intelligence and drive it directly into security technologies and make changes, and you can pull a lot of metrics together saying, we made this many changes to our environment based on intelligence, and pull some of those metrics together for organizations that are metrics driven. But the true value of intelligence is what's stopped, what doesn't happen. Not too different from, say, counterterrorism in the government space. Everybody understands the terrorist attack. Nobody understands the 200 that weren't successful that year because of intelligence. So that's a real challenge in the industry we're still working to overcome, is to better measure and explain ROI to leadership. Anybody else?
Thanks, AJ. I'm not seeing any more questions coming through the chat box.
Okay. Well, I hope this was really helpful. If anybody has any follow-on afterwards, I know that happens sometimes, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on the slide. Happy to chat anytime about where you are, where you're going, what we can do to help. And that doesn't necessarily come with a charge, by the way. So feel free to throw me an email or a phone call. I'm happy to just talk. This is what I like to do, is help people build programs and get better. It's better for everybody. So anytime, please do reach out to me. Otherwise, with no other calls coming down the line right now, no other questions, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this one up. And I look forward to talking to you all more in the future.